Welcome back, Dr. Ross, and welcome back to our listeners. As a reminder, this is part two of our mental health series, where Dr. Justin Ross and I have a conversation about what mental health is, why it's important, and how to cultivate an environment in your daily life, not only for happiness and well being, but for the best pursuit of your athletic goals in that athletic setting, which then, if you think about it, contributes back to the happiness and well being of just being a human being. I encourage anyone who didn't listen to part one to just pause here, go back and listen to that part one, because I don't want you to miss anything. We talk a lot about specific definitions and some buzzwords that are being used out there in the world right now that I think will help shape up the conversation that we have here in part two. But for those who are up to speed, let's jump right back into the show. And to you, Dr. Ross, just as a quick little reminder for our listeners as well as myself, could you give us your working definition of what mental health is once again?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be back. And yeah, and mental health to me is, again, this idea of these are our human experiences. Mental health is not what's wrong with you, it's what's happening with you, right? In your mind, in your body, in your emotions, in your relationships. And so the phrase we used the first time is, mental health is much more than the absence of disease. It's really understanding how our human experiences either point us towards optimism, vitality, vibrancy, growth, mastery, or they point us in a direction of distress, disease, anxiety, and stress. And so it's working with those experiences to get the most out of ourselves.
I really like that definition. And in part one, we talked about a lot of things, including this concept of balance. And for a lot of athletes, and I use this term too. Okay. I don't really like this term. I'm searching for like a better term of seeking balance in one's life in order to get what. And you and I talked about flow. We're both huge fans of flow in the context of happiness as well as athletic performance. But you also brought in this like concept of flow busters, something that takes away from flow, right? And it's a distraction that can take away from this kind of balance as well.
Right.
So, when athletes say, "Oh, I'm out of balance" and all this kind of stuff, it's usually because we're talking about some sort of like scale, right? Where we have a lot of stress on one side, and then we try to do things and hopefully sometimes take away things that would like balance the scale out, right? So that they feel balanced. The question to you, Doc, is that a good analogy to have? And part two is, does balance even exist?
Yeah, great questions. It gets a lot of attention in this space, especially in athlete mental health. And that whole idea of flow robbers, right? One of the biggest flow robbers we have is distraction and lack of presence. And balance or unbalance gets talked about a ton in this space. And
Yeah.
I think the better word, the better idea is really flexibility, right? Because what I hear so many people talk about with balance is there's pressure. I have to get it in. I have to do my workout or else, right? There's like this pressure. And in and of itself, that level of heightened arousal, that level of cognitive pressure is going to rob your chance of getting in a flow state anyway, right? So not only that does it rob flow, but it also doesn't feel good for people. That sense of pressure just doesn't feel good.
So flexibility, like I need to stretch my hamstrings out more, do some yoga or
Probably.
like that. This is, yeah,
This is probably true.
yes, that's a
If
good
you're
answer. But what kind of flexibility are we talking about?
Yeah, well, if you're anything like me, my hamstrings definitely need a lot of work. But so,
So much.
oh man, so psychological flexibility is really first and foremost recognizing that as human beings, we have a number of different values, and each of those values has importance. I think the problem with balance is there's often this experience of those values need to be held in equal proportions, right? So it needs to be balanced, right? And if you're going to perform optimally well in any place in your life, at some point you're going to get out of balance. And optimal performance is probably going to require that you're out of balance. But the key idea underneath all of it is that you have flexibility. Flexibility is understanding that different needs at different times are going to require different things, right? So if you're going all in on an important endurance goal, race goal, you're going to have to spend more time in the training bucket for a certain amount of your year, right? In order to accomplish that feat. That doesn't mean your family is less important or your work is less important. It means the time and energy that you can devote to those things is going to shift. Once the event is over, there's like a little bit of a recalibration, and maybe those other buckets get more time, energy, and attention. So the whole idea, I think it's important to think about living the life of an endurance athlete is having flexibility throughout your year, right? Thinking about your life as an athlete more from a year perspective rather than I just need to be in balance today, this week, right? It creates too much stress and too much tension for people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm glad you brought this up, and I'm definitely going to use that term flexibility more for sure. You have to be more flexible this week, this month, or this year for where we're going. Oftentimes, I'd always use, well, we got to get yourself out of balance before we find balance again, right? And for a lot of us, say in North America, a lot of us like masters or age groupers, it is January through September ish, right? We're out of balance in an athlete sense. And then holidays or the fall comes around, seasonal aspects kind of bring us back in. And then we try to seek and find some balance there. People live in, different parts of the world, and also professional athletes, it's not really that flow or that rhythm. Rhythm is not necessarily the case, but kind of get it, right? And I think how do you get more flexibility in your life, right?
Yeah.
That's probably the next great question. And I'll just first chime in with this is plan better or plan really well. And
Yeah.
that goes with yourself, plan with yourself, plan with your coach,
Mhm.
plan with your job, and plan with your family,
Right.
because that will help set the stage for being out of balance when you need to, and then coming back and reminding yourself that this is why we're doing what we're doing, and this is why things feel out of balance right now.
Yeah.
That's the way I've done it. Anything that you can say better,
Yeah.
Dr.
Well,
Ross?
I think so. Right before planning is identifying values.
Good
And
point. Yeah.
I think we often miss that part. And
Yeah.
I really encourage athlete coach relationship as you're thinking about the season or you're thinking about race goals, let's lay out what are your core values right now. And most of us at any one time probably have 3 to 5, right? I want to be really good at my sport, right? I'm targeting this goal,
Mhm.
right? I want to be I'm speaking personally now. I want to
Sure.
be a really good family member, right? I have 2 kids. So I want to be a solid presence in their life. I don't want to miss out on that. I want to really excel in my career and do good, meaningful work, right? So those are like the 3 things that take most importance. The other parts behind that, I want to like maintain my social relationships. I want to be a good steward of humanity, right? I want to make sure that those things get time and attention as well, right? So I think starting with that, like, what are your core values? 2, let's plan, right? What does that mean? Like, okay, it's looking like you're probably going to need to have a training schedule that looks like this. How do we make that work within the context of those other values? And then here's where flexibility comes in importance. And I was telling you about this about a week ago, right? So indoor
Mhm.
season here for part of it. I have a Peloton, and there was a day last week where Peloton was down. And if my life is pretty busy, so I have to plan. I had like an hour and 15 minutes for my training session, which means an hour of training, and then you know get ready, get done, shower, whatever. So I had 1 hour. That was it, and Peloton wasn't working. What the hell is this, right? So I was trying to get it to work, wasn't working. Went online, found out Peloton was down. Like, all right, well, what do I do here, right? And I think this is where we get unbalanced really quickly in the general sense of athlete wellness. We have a tendency to freak out, right? Oh my God, I'm not
Panic
going to
mode.
get my workout in. Doomsday, I'm not going to reach my goals. It's all catastrophe, right? We unravel so fast. It's unbelievable. And so here's the deal.
For sure.
I know all this. I recognize that in myself too. I was like, oh shit, I'm going to be down on volume for the week. I'm not going to get this workout in. Working out on a daily basis is really good for my physical health, my mental health. I really appreciate that outlet. I don't have the option today. My kids happen to be off of school that day. Like, oh, what are they doing? Oh, they're eating cinnamon rolls. I'm having a cinnamon roll. I'm hanging out with them. Right. And I just let go of the whole idea of needing to work out that day. And I said, I'm going to be present with my kids. My wife made these amazing cinnamon rolls. I'm hanging out, cinnamon rolls, kids. And it was great. So I shifted, like, that's a value, core value for me. And I was flexible. Underneath it requires this capacity to understand that we're all going to miss workouts.
Yeah.
It happens. Your long-term goals at the, at the whatever time of year are not going to be in jeopardy because you miss a single workout.
Like agree so much. And I remind my athletes of this. I remind myself too. I think the older I get, it's it's more like ingrained in there. I don't have to have even a self-talk conversation, but like, yeah, it doesn't matter. But what I do tell my athletes is like, doesn't matter. If one day makes or breaks us, we're doing something wrong. Therefore, not one day makes or breaks us, right?
Right.
And about also a week or two ago, whenever this happened, and you texted me that because we're working on something, this outline or whatever, I've used this example. I was like, hey, look, this is one of the best sports psychologists I know, and this is how he was flexible. So don't worry about it.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's such a great story because, yeah, at the end of the day, it's more about the big picture. It's more about that kind of like global stress, if it's about the workout aspect of it or the certain time period. And so I think by getting more flexible or having more flexibility in your life, it's going to take the pressure off, knowing that it's not today, but you know what, tomorrow we'll get after it again, right? And pick
Exactly.
back up.
And it's recognizing that all these are all values, and they're gonna, within each and every one of them, there's going to be disruption in your expectations for how you think things should be and the reality of how things are. And we have to mind the gap between expectations and reality, because that's often where we get ourselves in trouble. Where athletes get themselves in trouble is we lay so many expectations around how we think things should be, right? I should have this volume and I should be hitting these zones and my paces should be like this. And when there's any discrepancy, we freak out, right? We feel it like an identity threat, we feel it like a goal threat. And we have to have enough cognitive strength to take a step back. And to your point, it's such a great quote, right? If any one day is going to make or break us, we're doing something wrong. So it's being able to step back, look at the big picture, recognize consistency is key, right? Those long term goals are made over months, not in a single session.
Yeah, that's it. And I think comparison to, just when you were talking about all of those aspects, comparison to others really plays up with as a flow buster here, to put that pressure on, because once she starts comparing to her about her power numbers or the speed up a hill climb, or he starts to compare how this guy looks, and I mean that's a that's not only a flow buster, it's just a buzzkill, and it's very inaccurate, right?
Absolutely.
Because I like to encourage my athletes to compare themselves to themselves, like historically, the here and now, moving forward. It's not to say that I don't use data to make sure that we're on a level to compete at the level that the athlete wants to, right? I make some fact checks there, and then obviously then there's Strava, right, which is crazy in some regard, but it also is very strong in data. And it's a very good to look back to see how you're going, say, uphill climbs and on segments and things like this. But the over comparison can be a very big detriment when it comes to uh, flexibility and some of this like mental stress and mental unease that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. Another one of my favorite quotes: comparison is the thief of joy, right?
Ooh,
Which
that's a
was a
good one. Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt quote. And he threw that out there before this whole thing of the internet even existed. So he was onto something. And you're right. I think Strava is great in terms of the connection, right? The belonging we talked about in our first episode.
Yep.
But it can also really trip people up, because it can lead to this idea of this is how I should be. And I've seen so many athletes get caught in this idea of I have to have my numbers look like whatever for the world to see. And sometimes those numbers are to detriment to actually training to get you to your peak performance.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of strength to be able to use those tools in a way that's helpful and connection, but not harmful in our training.
Yeah. I mean, we don't need to go here, but zoom out, look at social media, right? Look at Instagram and how that pertains to what we're just talking about here. Strava is the segmented athlete approach of things, but you can see kind of my point. Where I think where it hits the target, where we need to talk about is education, but specifically awareness, right? With what actually matters. And I think with my athletes, a huge part of what I'm doing, both like consciously and subconsciously, is helping them become more aware of what's going on within themselves, what's going on without themselves, meaning like kind of a third person looking down upon sort of thing, and recognizing self talk, right? And so, meanwhile, educating them on, why training matters, globally, or, or why the day doesn't matter and all this kind of stuff. We also talked about awareness in part one, and I was like, oh, we'll get to that. So, to you, Dr. Ross, why is awareness so impactful and so powerful for a human being, let alone an athlete?
Yeah. Yeah. Awareness is really the cornerstone and the starting block for just about anything in either the mental health space or the performance psychology space,
Yep.
right? The saying that I used last time, one of my favorite sayings, I throw this around a lot. You cannot change what you are not aware of. And so if we're gonna achieve, we need to bring awareness to what's happening and recognize that there's probably a lot that's really happening to your benefit, right? It's pointing you in the right direction. Let's bring awareness to that. We can enhance those things, right? We can help you strengthen them. Let's also bring awareness to things that are maybe getting in the way or flow robbing you of your
Mhm.
opportunity to be successful. And then let's find ways to either accept some of those things or to navigate around them or to work on changing them completely. But we can't work on changing something if we're not aware of what it is that needs to be changed in the first place.
Yeah, that's it, 100%. And to that tune, I tell my athletes, I go, hey, this is a two-way street. I'm not a dictator. You're not a robot. So let's work together on making you become the best athlete you can be. And what I'm saying there is like, I want awareness from you, because you're going to get awareness from me and you're going to learn, right? But I want that because it's going to make this whole process better. And as you said, you can't work on stuff until you start to become aware of it. So whether it's perceived effort for pacing, right? Running a 10K or time trialing for a 20 or 40K, whatever, going up a hill climb, bringing awareness to the effort that you're doing as an athlete. That's kind of like primal, if you will. It's like step one. And then two, like you can rise up the ranks, and then you get into the kind of the space where we're at right now with sports psychology and self talk and whatnot. Um, but one thing I wanted to kind of throw out there, just a couple book recommendations and resources real quick, is there's two books. Well, one book that I encourage a lot of my athletes to read, and that's The Art of Learning by Joshua Awakens. I don't know if you've ever read that before, but it's a very good kind of starting place for like learning how to break down um, the elements of sport, and also like how to navigate through your own kind of self talk as you go. And the other one is Awareness by Anthony D. Mello, who that's an interesting one. Go check it out. The title kind of says what it's about, but it's going to take you in different angles. But I just want to throw those books out there while we're on this topic of awareness. Um, Anything to add to that, Doc?
No, I think those are great recommendations, and always supportive of people learning about their learning and having this meta approach to understanding the process of their thinking and the process of their mind, and really recognizing that the mind is a highly trainable skill,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And starting there, right, you can train your mind. I have this really silly idea, right, that most of us listening are English first speakers, right?
right.
And so much of what I see people come to me and they're like, I want to unlearn English and I want to learn something else. Not English, but something about the way they're thinking, right? And the whole idea in the mental health spaces or the sports psychology spaces, you cannot unlearn English. You cannot unlearn these things that naturally pop up in your thinking, how you appraise yourself. But what you can learn is you can learn Spanish, right? You can learn a new approach. You can learn a new sense of vocabulary. You can learn a new way to appraise these situations. But the starting point is recognizing what that English language is, what those thoughts are for you at baseline, and then over time, developing a new system of thought. That's really what we're getting at. So don't try to get rid of the thinking that you have. You have to work with it, and then you have to modify it, and then you can change it.
It's a really good way to put that. And I think with where we're going now, talking about athlete specific mental health, I've heard your talk before where you use a systems framework for some of this, where you talk about your three pillars or kind of three aspects of this framework. Could you tell us what those three pillars are and why it's important to an athlete's mental health?
Absolutely. So the first, not surprisingly, is awareness,
Yeah.
right? Just bringing awareness to all of this stuff in general. The second is really based on destigmatizing this approach, and we've seen this grow in leaps and bounds in the last few years. Where again, these are hazards of owning a mind, if you will. And whether you're performing on the world stage or you're going after your first 5K, the way you're thinking is going to greatly impact the way that you perform on that day. And so destigmatizing that there's nothing wrong with you. This is what's happening to you. This is you owning a mind. Let's enhance that is a really big part of that second step. The third is then embedding a culture of support, right? And this is really where these conversations are critical. It level sets that these are conversations we all should be having, right? On kind of a national scale, a global scale, but really within our communities. So I really challenge people listening, if you're part of, a cycling group, a running group, you have your long runs on the weekends. Are you talking about this stuff with your friends, with your running group, right? That's the way that we get to the heart of understanding that these things that we think are personally hindrances or bothersome to us are also experienced by everybody around us. And we can learn and we can enhance and we can do things to get the most out of ourselves, not only for optimal performance, but also because it increases the enjoyment in what we're doing.
Yeah, that it does. And as I'm kind of envisioning like these three pillars trying to hold up what we are considering, an athlete's mental health, I'm picturing all these like things kind of like existing on top of like these pillars, right? And that's like training and self-talk and communication, but also identity and what happens when it all goes away and all of these like disordered eating aspects, and she's doing that and he's doing this, therefore do I need to do that, like, so anxiety and depression and some of the other stuff that we talked about in part one. So I mean, is my visual kind of is
Yeah.
that pretty accurate? Is that what's kind of
Yeah. I think, like we use the idea of pillars because pillars support something,
right?
right? And the pillars here support the opportunity for mental health,
For sure.
right? And the opportunity for mental health supports being able to not only to enjoy your sport, but to be able to perform the way you want to perform.
Yep.
And so it kind of all funnels down, but those are really the things that are needed. And if we're not aware of what's happening, if we feel like we have to be secretive of what we're doing because the community around us doesn't support us, those things get internalized, and pretty soon that very first tier of pillars, it doesn't exist.
Right. Right. So some of these like flow busters are crawling up the pillars, you got to kick them off.
Yeah, you got to be aware of them, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh,
Oh,
there's
sure.
a
Yeah.
robber.
Am I
I
being
see
attacked?
you.
Yeah.
Let me figure out what I'm going to do about you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, all metaphors and somewhat joking aside, let's talk about some of the flow busters that can inhibit like the athlete mental health. Um, One I mentioned was identity, and I think that like first identity is it actually not really a flow buster necessarily because there's like some good and bad aspects that could be around it. It could just be neutral. So can you talk about like identity as it pertains to an athlete and
Yeah.
how it trickles over?
Yeah, and I love the framework around like thinking about flow robbers as an anchor point for some of this stuff because it can make it more
Yep.
relatable, right?
Yep.
So, and I think if we just start with the idea that flow has a few requirements, right? The first is you have to enjoy what you're doing, right? It has to be
Hmm.
personally meaningful. It has to have that internal level of motivation. Two, you have to be non-distracted. You have to be focused, and in a lot of ways, you have to be singly focused on whatever task is at hand. The third is then there has to be this like merging of challenge and skill. There has to be a sweet spot of that, right? If the task is far too easy, probably not going to hit flow. If the task is far too hard, probably not going to hit flow. It has to be challenging enough, just really kind of getting you to that point where you really have to have deep focus. So as identity relates to that, identity can either enhance that or it can rob that. And one of those areas that I see is again this ego attachment to metrics, which happens a ton in this space. I sometimes refer to this as the overquantified athlete, right? And I'm guilty of it too. I've got a Garmin on my wrist. I've got, a computer on my bike. I can measure, I mean, man, I can measure all kinds of things. And it's, some of those metrics matter. Some of those metrics really don't matter, but we make them matter. And the more that we make them matter and the more we tell ourselves a story that they have to be a certain way or else, the more likely we're going to get in this place of robbing flow. I've had a number of instances of this, of working with people over my career. I had, the idea of streaks. I had somebody I worked with had to run a 5K a day for 1,000 days in a row, and
Wow.
like, wow, man, where did that come from?
I was just going to ask
And
that. I
yeah,
was going to be like,
right.
how did he
Because
come up
it's
with
the
that?
first question. Like, wow, I'm really curious. That's really intriguing. And
Yeah.
like all things, it didn't start out one day and say like I'm going to do this 1,000 days in a row. It started out shorter, but along the way, it became harder and harder to let go of because there is this sort of like loss attached to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm already 300 days in. What's going to happen if I stop now? I'm already 500 days in. Now I told people about it. Now I'm really committed.
Mm-hmm.
And it created a lot of distress because now he was having to do this thing. He felt he had to do this thing, even though it no longer provided any meaning, any purpose, or any enjoyment. In fact, it provided quite the opposite.
Yeah. 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 And that's where, again, I think that viewing something as neutral, like you said, can be the flow robber. But I'm also going to create this new term. Maybe it's but you said like enhance flow. So let's call that a flow enhancer, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah. And ego, I mean, we could talk a lot about that, but I think that I just say in general, let go of the ego and everything else will go a lot better, right?
right.
Especially in an athletic competitive setting.
Well, in that place, there's flexibility again. And the
Good point.
drive for that is,
Hmm.
can you have ego flexibility about this performance? And that gives this possibility of it can be a range. And as we all know, right, over the course of months of training, there are going to be some days that feel really great and it feels more effortless and you hit flow. And there are going to be other days that just feel really hard and challenging. And you maybe can't even put your finger on why. Our job is to not get overly excited about those good days, like have appreciation for them, but don't get overly down on yourself for those down days, right? And take that bigger, flexible approach to say, okay, this thing is built over the course of time.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned that because as soon as I said what I said about ego, I was like, that's not actually how I view it. Because there's part of it that's like, and we can talk about definition of ego or not, but like a part of the ego drives us to do something, right? To achieve something. And it's not to say that letting go of an ego takes away drive to achieve, right? But it's associating, some of these, you know, the flow robbers from it, or associating some sort of guilt if you don't achieve, right? And I always say like, hey, look, like let go of ego, but compete like no tomorrow. Because when everybody's faster, you go faster. And when you go faster, that's kind of what it's all about, right? Because that is super fun. Whether you got the gold medal or not, or they're handing out gold medals, who cares? You went fast, man. And
Yeah,
that's what I mean by, hey, let go of the ego. It doesn't matter if you beat him or not. How'd you do?
right.
Right.
Yeah, and
Kind of thing.
and flow is based on that. It's based on the experience in
100%.
the moment of movement, not based on looking down at your bike computer and saying, am I zone 2 flow, zone 4 flow? Like, where am I at here? Like
Yeah.
flow robbers. And again, it's our relationship with those metrics that are important to set up training and to have a better understanding of what's happening. But really, the whole idea of flow is like absorption in the moment, in
Yeah.
that experience of movement.
And one quick, I love throwing out book recommendations, but for anybody who is like, flow, cool, I know what that is, but maybe you don't, because it's actually like a really big deal and you should probably like read more about it. The grandfather of flow is, I always butcher his name, but it's like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And I'd say just Google that into like, or put that into Google, find it on Amazon, whatever you want. His book called Flow. Read it. It's awesome. I think he takes a ton of research and makes it very digestible and readable. Also, he's got a TED Talk and a few other things. He's now passed away, sadly. But that guy, he is the grandfather of flow. He was actually researching happiness at the time in non-athletic populations, and then derived this concept of flow. So if anybody was like, okay, they're talking a lot about flow, but I want to know more, or you
Yeah.
think you know a lot, but you don't, read it. It's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, arguably from where I sit, maybe the most important sports psychology understanding in our generation,
Yeah.
because it connects to so many things. And to your point, it was trying to understand happiness. And really, what we're understanding is it's not happiness that's achieved that is actually providing us a high quality of life. What leads us to feeling the good life is those moments of absorption into the task at hand. Now, the beauty of being an endurance athlete is that is what we're all about. And I think in some ways, the reason we do this is we've had those moments, right? Whether we're on a trail or in our running shoes or on a bike or whatever, in the water, whatever it may be, all of those elements of movement give us the opportunity to experience that. And it's an amazing feeling once we're there.
Yep, it is. And so as we're seeking flow, right, and we're talking about these things that can enhance it or rob it, one thing that robs it instantly, and it's a pretty interesting like observation of psychology as well as habit, is when an athlete gets injured. The reason I pose it like that is because typically when an athlete does get injured, it is they could have, well, they probably weren't in flow at the time, or something really outside came in and made them not flow, right? But they're going pretty good, in other words. And then all of a sudden an injury occurs and it makes them stop instantly, which sends off a whole cascade of psychological as well as physiological stuff. Could we talk more about injury here and how to kind of use some of this framework to tell ourselves or tell our athletes that, hey, it's going to be okay here?
Yeah. Yeah. We could spend a lot of time on injured athletes. First and foremost, being injured sucks. Let's just start there. Let's call it
Right
what it
on.
is.
Yep.
It sucks. It's really hard. And for a lot of reasons, right? The first conversation we had, understanding where anxiety, depression, human suffering, how they impact things, those are all involved in being an injured athlete, right? We have loss, first and foremost, loss of functioning, right? Physically, in whatever capacity, but loss of connection to sport, right? And for us, we spend a lot of time, training and being connected. And for, when we're injured, we lose that time, we lose that ability to train. And that can have cascading effects on our mental health, our well-being, our community, all kinds of things. We also insert a lot of anxiety here, right? There's often a lot of uncertainty about, oh, I'm not really sure what this means, how long I'm going to be out. There's uncertainty about when I'm going to get back to my baseline, uncertainty about those long term goals that we've established for ourselves. And when you put those two things together, like immediately what we see is anxiety and depression. And when you put that together, when your identity is being threatened, well, now you have the perfect ingredients for a lot of anger. So we get a lot of anger first, the first step of being injured as an athlete. The reason I call that out, one, you have to give yourself permission to recognize that that's all completely normal, right? That is a normal part of this experience that you need to give yourself validation for and permission to work through. Sometimes working through the emotional, the cognitive, the psychological elements of an injury are as hard, if not more difficult, than doing the physical rehab that is asked of you at the same time.
Yeah, that's super good to hear, and it's also a good reminder too. And I think as I observe injury for what it is, especially within my athletes, it's definitely easier to kind of say the words to help guide them through it, right? Because I'm not the one necessarily having to deal with it. So I think somebody can hear me and say it'll all be okay and we'll get back on it and all this. And they're probably saying, oh, it's easy for you to say, you don't have to sit on the trainer now, or you don't have to sit in bed. But I get it. Like I've had some pretty gnarly injuries, and I think for me, that loss of the ability to find flow, because through an athletic and kinematic context, that's how I find flow. And I do find myself more irritable when I'm not engaged in that. And therefore, when injury happens, injury does suck, yes. But primarily because it's like, oh, my flow meter is down. It's
Right.
that. Meanwhile, the whole body is building itself back up. However, I do think that taking that long term view, and this is where your term of or your concept of flexibility comes into play. It's like, hey, it's got to be a little bit more flexible right now because we'll get it back, right?
Yeah, and in some ways, and this is really challenging, but it's flexibility is important, but also understanding that being injured is very much being a part of being an athlete.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that's a good point.
yeah, maybe it's a threat to this season, whatever that may mean for you, but it needs to be a part of this larger athlete identity that so many of us occupy. It's not just based on one season or one race or one event. It's often based on a lifetime of experiences. And some of those experiences, if we capture injury as an experience, this is an experience I'm going through as being part of being an athlete, it can help sort of recapture what this means in the grand scheme of things. Now, again, that's all to say that's easier said than done, and it's way
Hmm.
easier to say from somebody who's healthy and not injured at the time of saying it.
Yep. Yep. And it's part of that destigmatization process back to your three pillars, right? Where when somebody gets injured, and somebody's like, "Oh, this sucks," sure, but then they're like, "Oh man, if I would have been stronger, if I would have done that," or they start to associate shame with that injury, right? And that's exactly what you're saying is like, hey, this is part of being like riding your bike, dangerous, right? Running can be being an athlete, dangerous. Waking up in the morning, dangerous. But you know
Mhm.
what? It's also pretty cool.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, and it requires a bit. There's another great saying, right? Like, a ship is safest at harbor, but that's
mm,
not what it's meant for,
that's it. Yeah.
right? And we are, we go out here again because we want to push limits and test limits and self-discover, and it is a hazard of moving our bodies um, in such fast ways, repeatedly over the course of time.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And some of this destigmatization that I also want to talk about is also for athletes. I feel like one area in psychology as well as it relates to athletes is what I'm saying is disordered eating or what we call relative energy deficiency syndrome. And it's in multiple sports. It's not, it's not any one sport. I would say it's across many um, different forms in the athlete population. But I want to bring some light to it and have a conversation about it, even if it's a little short, because I want to bring awareness to it, as we talked about how sometimes you may not even know if this is you, right?
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
think having a conversation about it in this manner can be really helpful. So Doc, can you tell us what reds is and kind of a little bit of the history about it?
yeah. So I mean, like disordered eating in general, start there is a really common element in the athletic world, and the framework that I think we need to start with is understanding that most of the time, if not all the time, disordered eating starts from the idea of it's going to enhance performance somehow,
Yeah.
right? It's not done. Nobody signs up for this saying, I want this to take over my identity. It's done in usually small ways at first. I'm going to tweak something, I'm going to adjust something, I'm going to restrict something because I believe doing so is going to allow me to move my body faster, right? I'm going to increase my performance. Now, what often happens is there can be this vicious cycle where, we all require calories, obviously, just to live our lives, but we have a unique constellation of that given the work we do and given how much time we spend training. And when you start to get into this deficiency, right, relative energy deficiency, what happens is there becomes a very big imbalance between the calorie needs that you have as a human being and as an athlete and the calories that you're giving yourself. And over time, what will often happen for people is this starts slowly, but performance actually doesn't increase. Performance starts to decrease. And when that decrease starts to happen, there's a little bit of frustration. And the thought almost always is, oh, I know, I just need to do more of the thing and then I'll get there. More restriction, more withholding food, what have you. Performance continues to decrease to a point where, for women especially, there can be some pretty significant problems. A couple of the cornerstones of REDS in women is amenorrhea, so loss of menstrual cycle, and negative impact on bone mineral density. So you start to lose some bone density as well, which both of those things have long-term implications for just health in general, let alone performance.
Yeah, and to that cyclical nature of how eating disorders tend to manifest and also just keep going is usually when the athlete starts with decreased calories and decreased weight loss, they're going to see a nice bump in performance, typically, especially in like endurance athletics and in other parts. Um, and so that initial like bump in performance is, I'm going faster, I'm more efficient, all these things, right? And then people start to notice and they say, hey, you're looking lean. Hey, you're going faster uphill. So it's adding to that and say, oh, more is better, right? Because we're athletes, we're Americans right here talking, and that's how we think. And I'll bring this up and say, because if anybody's listening, they're like, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. Like, I don't, first of all, I'm not an expert here. Okay. But I wrestled for years of my life. I wrestled from grade school all the way to, all the way through college. And then I started racing bikes. Right. And, but looking back on it now and having the awareness that I have now, full fledged eating disorder, right? Because initially it was like I was the fat kid and I was, it started wrestling, lost a bunch of weight, started to be good at sports, and it just got out of control. My parents actually brought me to like psychologists and stuff. That didn't go well, and I bring that up, and it's personal for sure. I've never really even talked about that, let alone on a podcast, but to many people. But I bring it up to destigmatize it because I thought it was good for me because it was increasing my performance. And all the problems that I had, like mentally and also physically, kind of throughout, like through high school and college, and all this kind of stuff. As I look back on it now, I'm like, man, I was messed up. And I didn't do anything about it because I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and at the time there wasn't probably a culture that supports it. And in fact,
No.
what we can see is there's almost cultures that enhance it or encourage it. And in sport, we see this a lot. And there are some sports that tend to have a higher rate of disordered eating than others. And they are things like you're talking about that are bodily focused, that are weight focused, right? That you have to hit a certain number on a scale in order to compete in a certain class. And so there's already this intuitive drive towards thinness, towards restriction. And when you pair that with, oh, this is going to increase my performance or this is going to help the team, those are often kind of the ingredients that really start this into motion.
Yeah. And I mean, to this point of wrestling, I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, it's weight class. It was, at the time that I was doing it, it was, you were encouraged to lose weight in order to hit it. And not only that, but like Saturday mornings, because we typically weigh in Saturday mornings, eat a bunch and then wrestle. Like Saturday mornings, you'd weigh in, you'd be in a line in your underwear in a gymnasium with people like just standing there and, with a clipboard and say, did you make weight or not? Drop your drawers, stand on the scale, and away you go. Meanwhile, everybody's, not everybody's in the gym to watch the weigh-in, right? But there's a lot of people there, right? And so you're just naked, cold and naked and hungry, right?
Yeah.
And it's all this observation. Did you make weight? You get in trouble if you don't, all that kind of stuff. Then there's cycling, right? And when I was directing some teams, there was one athlete who had come from a European team. Now he's on a North American team, and kind of somewhat, this sounds bad, but like kind of making some fun about that team and some eating disorder type stuff. But it was like legit during base training season, they would have to step on a scale, and the person that was weighing them would pinch him and be like, well, maybe you don't have dinner tonight, kind of thing. And it was like, it's
Yeah.
real, people,
Yeah,
it's
I've worked
real.
with a number of, well, a lot of athletes in all sports, but the professional cycling is, notorious for that, at least historically with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
athletes that I've worked with,
Historically.
right? And a lot of these athletes that I've had in the past have said, my coach would say, and they're all from Europe, right? You need to drop 2 kilos by tomorrow or you can't train, right? I've worked with some, there's a team of athletes who professional athletes with diabetes. And, that's a whole area where people are learning how to, um, you know, mimic and play with their insulin in an effort to lose weight. And it's called diabulimia, right? Where they're using insulin as a way to weight loss. And again, it's all tangled up in performance. It's all tangled up in identity. And it can become really overwhelming and encompassing very quickly.
It can. And so all that being said is, I want to bring some awareness to it. I want to recognize that, in our sport, endurance sport, which, it's pretty rampant, right? And if this brings some awareness, to the listener, to you, and you want to talk more about it, I'd say, you could bring it up with your coach. You could go seek out a sports psychologist as well to just check in on it. Because if you're having some of these patterns or seeing some of those that we've been talking about, start having the conversation now, become more aware of it.
Yeah, yeah. And the first step is talk to somebody that you feel support with, right? So the first
Yeah.
step is always, I think, talk to somebody that you believe is going to validate and support, and then talk to somebody who can help, right? And especially in this space, finding somebody with a counseling, therapy, psychology background who's doing this work with folks struggling with disordered eating and understands the world of athletics, because that can be a unique overlap, is really, really important.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Well, as we kind of transition from a little less weightiness into some like fun aspect of it, there's this performance psychology, and this term called performance psychology. And I think, I don't know, you tell me, Doc, is this something for our listeners here on the show, or is it just an area of psychology that deals with only the top pros chasing gold medals or something like that?
Yeah, great question, right? And I think starting point is, if you have a mind, you can probably benefit from working on your mind, right? Again, the mind
Yes.
is a highly trainable skill. And one of those first myths that I hear from people is that it's only for elites, it's only for professionals, it's only for those on the world stage. And the truth is, it's for everybody, that this is really about understanding, bringing awareness to what's helping you, let's enhance that, what's maybe getting in the way, and let's work on tweaking that.
Gotcha. So what is performance psychology when we kind of throw that aspect around? If it's not just for elites, if it's for people with all minds and bodies associated with those minds, what is performance psychology? What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's really the art and understanding of the interplay between mind and body, and specifically in the performance context, right? So
Mhm.
psychology is just our thoughts and our feelings as it relates to our lives in general. Performance psychology is understanding our thoughts and our feelings as it relates to a performance outlet, right? And understanding
Gotcha.
that when we're trying to do something in the world of sport, there are going to be some specific skills and some areas of development that we can work on enhancing, because it's going to help us, right? One of the other myths that we often see is that, oh, if I'm working on this, if I'm seeing a performance psychologist, it means that there's something wrong with me. And the majority of time, actually, that's not even close to true. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. It means we're going to teach you skills. We're going to help you maximize so that you get the best out of yourself in whatever endeavor it is that you're pursuing.
Yeah. So essentially, it's like, when you want to take it to the next level, you can do that. There doesn't have to be something wrong. And this goes back to like what we're talking about, which is like general mental health. It doesn't have to be born out of disease while you're seeking help. It can be born out of something fun.
Absolutely. And it can be born out of that ambition, right?
Yeah.
I want to go and tackle this challenge, whatever that is. I'm going to need some help to get there. And we've understood the importance of coaches in the physical space for physical development. We've understood coaches in the strength training space, right? I need to get stronger. We've understood that in the nutrition sense. I need to dial in my nutrition to get the most out of my body. And now we're understanding that in the mental side too. I need to get the most out of my mind and my thinking, and I need to learn how to drive this thing. Once I've built the machine, now I need to learn how to drive it appropriately. So these are really skills and areas that help enhance that process.
So once someone talks to a performance psychologist and they start to put that into play, is that the end all be all? Are they now impervious to all the flow robbers out there, or how does that work?
Right? Man, if it could only be that simple, I would love
Right.
that. Right?
I
Yeah,
would too.
that's the last myth here, is that doing so is going to make you like invincible, right? Or you're going to be able to run through walls or just go out and smash your PRs. And that's not the case, right? We know that this helps you in those moments to get the most out of yourself, but you still have to do all the other things. You have to do the physical training, you have to put the time in, And the important part is like developing these mental skills while you're doing the physical training. So there's a lot of approaches that you can think about doing before training, in the middle of your training, and after training to really enhance this entire process.
So two elements to this performance psychology, from what I understand, is one is emotional intelligence. As I read about that, part of me was just like, wow, well, this goes back to our awareness component. Can you tell us, like, becoming aware of yourself, so to speak?
Yeah.
Um, is it that, or is there more than just becoming self-aware?
Yeah, there are really there's a lot to it, but there's just two main components. The first component is awareness,
Okay.
right? Awareness of self, awareness of thoughts, awareness of feelings, being able to recognize what's happening. And that, especially as we're moving our bodies for long periods of time, we have this relationship in our thoughts about what's happening. So being aware of that's the first part. The second big part is going to be focused on regulation, right? Regulating our emotions, regulating our body, regulating our thoughts so
Mhm.
that we can perform optimally. There's a lot of compelling data that shows that emotionally intelligent athletes are going to, not only be more aware, but they're going to make better decisions, right? And in the
Yep.
context of endurance sports, where we're out there for hours, sometimes days at a time, being able to be grounded and making good decisions and regulating those experiences is really going to enhance our performance.
Yep. And it's not just like one thing that you do that all of a sudden you're now emotionally intelligent. The reason why I say that is like, as it pertains to endurance athletics, your pursuit of being an athlete is a continual kind of ping pong between self awareness and self regulation, right? Back and forth, back and forth. How did I do? Can I do it better next time? And I think in part one, we were talking about using breath to kind of regulate either an effort or find calmness, when there's anxiety. And I think it's in part that as well, where there's these mantras or keywords that you can come back and use some experience from last year's race to help you now based on a thing that you become aware of in the moment. Then you cue yourself to become self-regulating to, I'm hungry. Oh yeah, I need a gel. Simplistically, right?
Mhm,
So this
mhm.
kind of this emotional intelligence. Am I on the pulse there with that?
Yeah, I think awareness becomes the cue,
Yeah,
right? Awareness of whatever it may be,
sure.
something
Yep.
that helps generate a response, right? And again, the response could be in mind, it could be in body, it could be in breathing, it could be in emotion, but the awareness helps generate that response.
Got it. Okay. And then the second aspect of the performance psychology is this psychobiological model, meaning what? We're trying to connect mind and body and make better decisions
Yeah, in part, right? And I think
in part.
this
Yep.
model, the psychobiological model, is kind of the wave that we're in now in terms of understanding. And it really, to understand it, let's go back a couple of models previously. So
Sure.
the original models around endurance performance were really based on, peripheral and central fatigue initially,
Right.
right? We have central nervous system exhaustion, we have peripheral skeletal muscle exhaustion, and once those things hit, that's it. You're done. You can't do anymore, right? And in part, there's parts of that are true, right? Absolutely.
Hmm.
The second model is called the central governor. And the central governor is this idea that starts to understand the role of the brain in regulating, monitoring our systems. And really, the model there is understanding that the brain is going to regulate things to a point that we don't push ourselves to a point of physical detriment or death, right? So it's this understanding of the brain is sort of paying attention. And there are parts to that are also true. But both of those models disregarded anything to do with motivation, self talk, psychology at all. It wasn't even a consideration in the model. The psychobiological model is where we're at today. And it's the understanding that our bodies are pretty important, obviously, in endurance sports, but our minds are the drivers of that. And there are two pieces that are probably the most important. One is motivation in connection to our goals, right? So the more meaningful your goals are, the more likely you're going to tolerate discomfort, distress, find a way through them. And the second is our cognitive appraisal is a huge determining factor in what we do next, right? So if we're out there and our thoughts are, this is terrible, I'm really suffering, I've got so much farther to go, there's no way I can make it. Well, guess how that's going to play out for you? versus, whoo, this is intense, right? This is really hard. This is a challenge that I wanted. I've got what it takes. Let's keep pushing, right? Two very different roads. And I understand there's a lot of gray in between,
Hmm.
but the way that we're appraising our bodies, our situation, how much distance we have left to cover, what our thoughts are, what our experiences are, how meaningful it is, those things drastically impact what we do in those moments of endurance.
Makes sense. Where my mind is going now is kind of in our final, well, we'll have to wrap this soon, or else we just keep on going with this Rogan model that I tend to put you in here, Doc. Rogan in a good way. If they're, I don't know if that's a bad triggering word right now, but um, thus I digress. Where my brain is going is how to put this into place, right? Like mindset training, and for my athletes, I've actually reached out to some coaches as well, is to talk about like where it really matters, and the word motivation keeps on coming to. Like, how do I keep my athletes motivated? How do I stay motivated? And how do I even cultivate motivation? So when it comes to actually putting this stuff into play, we can model all day, right? But what do you have for our listeners who even having troubles like staying motivated day to day?
Yeah, I think part of motivation is really finding what excites you. And again, one of the areas that I see is of concern for the amateur athlete is we get this identity connection to who we think we are, right? And it's rooted in language. I am a runner. I am a marathoner. And what I see happen, if we use that as an example, is well, now all of a sudden, all other endurance opportunities don't fit, right? I can't do that because I'm a marathoner and that's what I said I am and that's what I'm doing. And I have to run whatever we've assigned ourselves to. And over time, and I've experienced this personally, right? I had to work through my own shifting around this, is we lose that energy, we lose that excitement, and we become demotivated. And often what we do is we blame ourselves. I said I'm a runner, I just don't feel like running. What's wrong with me? When really we need to look at what's exciting, right? And so we need to have this flexibility in rediscovering who we are as athletes, right? And we need to keep it higher level. I'm an athlete. I'm an athlete who runs. I'm an athlete who does triathlons. I'm an athlete who swims, who cycles, who hikes, whatever. When we keep it on that athlete level, it permits more flexibility in what we're doing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think it's this weird like dichotomy maybe of having specific goals to attain, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to achieve this, versus, hey, I'm just here to ride my bike. Hey, I'm just here to run. Go back to your analogy of the guy running 1,000 days or a 5K for 1,000 days, right? Like at some point, he lost the joy, which then lost the motivation, right? Whereas, if he took a day off and he ran 999 5Ks in 1,000 days, and that's all it took, that's still pretty cool, right?
Right, right.
If he, but essentially, what you're doing, you take away some of that pressure in order to remind yourself of why you're doing what you're doing. And I think from a motivational standpoint of what I try to like communicate to my athletes, or even try to instill in myself, is like when you're not feeling it, just do it. Just like when you're not, well, first of all, let me backtrack. When you're not feeling it, if you just need a rest day, cool, do it. Because like, again, going back to our point, there's no one day that's going to make or break, right? Specifically, I tell my athletes, hey, it, if you're not overly fatigued and all this kind of stuff, and you're just like the mojo's low, just do your warm up, and then you can do the main set, or you can just ride your bike, or you can just go home. I would say 9 times out of 10, people do their warm up, and it's like a general warm up, maybe a few openers or something like that. All of a sudden, like that action, that physical action, leads to a emotional motivation that brings them through a main set, or brings them through the duration of the workout. And then they're like, oh, that is all I needed. And now I'm feeling better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there's, yeah, I think
So
part
what's
of it is,
going on there, I guess.
yeah, for sure. Like there's micro motivation, which we all are going to feel this in the rhythm of a training cycle, a training block. We're going to have days, we're going to have weeks where we're just like, oh man, I'm just not into it today or right now.
Yeah.
That's okay. Normalize that, permit it. It makes sense. And it's often, you're right. The recommendation there is, let's just get started. Put your shoes on, right? Just put your shoes on, go ramble around outside for a little bit, see how you feel. And if you're up for it, cool. And if not, whatever. Come on back. It's all good. There's also more like what I call existential motivation that we see with athletes where it's, oh God, I don't want to run anymore. And yet I told myself I'm going to run. And now I'm dealing with this existential dread and this questioning about what I've told myself I'm going to do, or what I've told the world I am, or how the world sees me, and what I'm actually feeling. That process is much more complicated, where we have to kind of sort through and realign and then find a way back to this athlete layer, find that joy, that purpose, that meaning. Those are often the things that we lose when we're not motivated. It's not loss of motivation, it's loss of joy, purpose, or meaning. So finding our way back to there can be challenging at times.
Yeah. So to kind of organize what we're talking about here when it comes to, say, mindset training, you've laid out that there's foundational skills, which is in part identity, motivation, commitment, self concept,
Yeah.
separate from high performance mindset, where it's self talk, attentional control, cognitive appraisal, and this sort of thing.
Yep.
And I think, I think where my analogy, that may be more in the high performance, but it means still speaking on the motivational, but it's on a surface level sort of thing. How do I get out there today versus I might have to stop here. So how does like the foundational skills and the high performance mindset kind of lead into what a listener can do with some of these things, whether they are, trying to decide, oh man, do I keep racing for another season or do I I'm hanging up, or maybe that's not the greatest sort of thing because it's a very big question. But I guess the overarching question would be how to separate these two skills or these two segments of foundational skills and high performance mindset in order to get what we want out of ourselves for sport.
Yeah. So I think the foundational skills for me are things that we think about as, in a way, like kind of like base training, right? These are things that can be done year round with or without a race, but are really important to think about as you're establishing your season, right? And so I really challenge people to think about this kind of base building, this physiological, foundational, psychological skill building as being critical to the start of your season, right? It sets the tone for your year. It goes back to flexibility, goes back to identifying values, goes back to setting up plans, goes back to understanding what your motivation is, your reasons why you've signed up for whatever race or event you've signed up for. And it really helps to set the tone for then layering on that second tier of skills. That second tier of skills then is specific mindset training or sport specific mindset training that you'll do as it relates to your event, right? And this differs, right? If you're going after, a 100-mile ultra, the work you're going to do there to dial in high performance mindset is going to be different than if you're trying to, crush a 1 mile on a track, right? So that's very different skill set. A lot of it is overlapping, but we have to train specificity in mind, just like we train specificity in body. The last bit then is I call it like the tip of the pyramid is executing when it counts, right? And these are really specific skills. These are skills that are directly in relation to your event as you're getting ready for your event, right? These are skills you're probably not doing in February if you're signed up for a fall race, right? But these are things you're starting to think about, and they build upon that high performance mindset training that you've been doing in and out of your daily training for weeks and months on end.
Yeah. And man, I feel like we almost need a part 3 where we can talk about like executing when it counts. Cause personally, I'm pretty interested in that, like the mental toughness, the grit, right? Like, how do we train that? So if you're ever up for another 2 hours of your life, you let me know, Doc. But here's a kind of a curiosity question. Do you ever meet an athlete who they come to you, say from a performance psychology standpoint, and they're like, okay, I want to get better. And then you do your thing. And then like, you know what? I don't think I need this. Like, I got this. This is too complicated. I'm out. I mean, do you have anybody like that or?
Yeah, all the time, right? And
Really?
I think that's it's related to any part of coaching, right? Where
Sure.
there's, I think, a lot of people who kind of they want to tiptoe in this space because they're curious and they're interested and they want to learn, but then maybe it's not a good fit, or maybe they already have their stuff figured out, or sometimes maybe because there's some some anxiety and apprehension. And I think that goes with any of these disciplines, whether that's mindset training, physical training, nutritional training, strength training. I think there's a lot of curiosity and tiptoeing in and
Mhm.
then backing away for a number of reasons.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've met athletes who I've seen their data and they're like, okay, so can you help me? Can I do, or how can I get better? And it's like, hey, you're going pretty good. I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. So for those of us, self included, who haven't reached that level, are there any more resources that we can listen to or read or digest of? We're talking books or other podcasts that we want to learn more to take what we learned from this two-part series here on mental health and just keep on building upon it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Right. I think there's a lot of great resources, especially in the performance psychology space. So I usually turn everybody on to a book called Endure by Alex Hutchinson as a starting point. It's well written, great writer. Love the way he presents this material. It's easy to digest and yet really fun and exciting at the same time. And it really is a deep dive on the psychobiological model, right? Kind of understanding how we got here, having very specific stories and cases where he brings these things to light. It's an amazing book, right? I'd really recommend people check that out. The other book that I like in the space is called How Bad Do You Want It, which is written by Matt Fitzgerald, which is also based on the psychobiological model, right? This idea of how bad you want it, how meaningful, how important your goals are is going to fundamentally shape what you do in training and in racing. And it's a kind of chapter by chapter approach where he takes a certain situation and he breaks down these concepts. Those are great books for people to check out. A podcast that I like, there's a lot of podcasts that I like, but Finding Mastery by Michael Gervais is really good in this space. And he has people from all kinds of performance avenues, business, entrepreneurship, sport, athletics, come on and talk about their model for how they're working on enhancing their performance and their well-being. So lots of great shows on there for people to check out as well.
I'm glad to see that there's a Venn diagram of our resources here that we enjoy. The Finding Mastery podcast is really really good. I think Gervais does a wonderful job of bringing in some really high, like high end, high achievers and he breaks it down. It makes it pretty digestible, all kind of related to that performance psychology. And Alex Hutchinson, I mean, I've been a huge fan of his sweat science writing on Outside Magazine, so you can check them out there. We also did a podcast on the Train Right podcast, actually back to episode number 2, where I was terrible, but he was awesome. And we talk all about his book, and I made a joke that I was kind of serious about that he needs to kind of do a book number 2. But he's a fantastic writer and definitely is all about what we were talking about with this performance mindset training. So great resources there. In summary, Doc, I, man, we covered a ton between both episodes here, and I think the biggest one was bringing awareness to a lot of these topics, whether it was defining what mental health is or talking about some of the key buzz terms out there that people are experiencing through true trauma and grief through COVID and the war in Ukraine and the unpredictability of where this climate is going, right? Just in our life. That pertains to our athlete life, right? Because it gives us cognitive overload, if you will, and we can't, and sometimes we can't then even have the energy or the motivation or the mindset to deal with what our coach gives us to pursue our athletic goals, which stresses out even more, right? So then we talked about having flexibility versus balance, right? And how that can help lead to having greater success or happiness, in your pursuit of your sport. So all that to say, what else did I miss? And what would you like our listeners to be left with on this last episode here?
Yeah, great question. I think the takeaway is your mind is a highly trainable skill, and mental health is happening. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. It's the combination of your thoughts, your feelings, your relationships, your connection to meaning. So the challenge I'll leave everybody with is how are you training your mind in and out of sport, right? How are you working before training, in the middle of training, after training, to really enhance your performance and get the most out of yourself. Start there with that awareness platform, and then you slowly take skills and you embed them into what you're doing in your running shoes, on your bike, wherever you are, to really optimize your performance.
Those are wonderful points. And my last final word on that is because everything that you just described was what Anders Ericsson wrote about in his book Peak, where he's talking about deliberate practice, not just practicing. And so if that spurs anything on in people's brains and say, what? It's how you're doing something rather than just what you're doing. And that's what Dr. Ross here is talking about. All right, Doc. So if every listener was like, whoa, I got to get more Dr. Ross in my life, can they find you on the socials? Where can they connect with you more?
Yeah. So, yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I'm on there. I have a website, drjustinross.com. And yeah, Strava, man, all things Strava. So you can
That's right.
find me on there as well.
Very cool. Uh, are you taking clients? Like if somebody listens here and they say, well, this is great, I want to work with Justin, how do I do that?
Yeah. You can find my contact info on my website, and then just shoot me an email. Email is going to be the easiest way. And then we can get connected and figure out how we can help you on your path moving forward.
Great. And for our listeners, if you do want to find his website or his Strava, or the article that I originally mentioned in our intro in part one, we have a landing page where all these resources will be put there, including the book recommendations and podcast recommendations from both Dr. Ross and I. So please head over to the trainright.com, and up on the little top, it'll say Trainright Podcast. You can click there and find our landing page and all the information. So, Dr. Ross, thank you again for coming back on the Trainright podcast and ripping through all this amazing content. Thank you for your time, your energy, and your flow today.
Oh, man, appreciate the invite. Always good to connect with you, and look forward to part 3 when we get around to that at some point, too.
There we go. I'm game.
Yeah.